Hello and welcome to Season 14, Episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions. I'm Adam Bishop.
I am Mark Bishop.
And this is, of course, the season finale of Season 14. We're reading the final chapter of Russell Kirk's The Conservative Mind, this time talking about the chapter, The Recrudescence of Conservatism. So kind of a summary, a little bit of the whole book, a little bit of looking forward where he thinks, writing this in 1953, what he thinks the state of conservatism is in England, in the United States, and what he thinks the major issues will be, what the possible successes could be going forward, generally just where we're at with conservatism and what the future looks like.
Yes, and thank you for reminding me the publication date.
Yes, you're welcome.
Because there's a lot of stuff in here I think is dated.
Yes, very much so.
I mean, it was true at the time.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I don't mean that he was wrong. But yeah, I'm sure we'll go through that. But it's like, ooh, yeah, that's true. That's what was true then.
Mm-hmm.
It is no longer true in 2026.
Right.
And he's not making predictions, so he's not in error, not
Mm-hmm.
necessarily.
Right.
He's hopeful, guarded, I guess.
Right. Yeah.
So I like the first line. Conservatism has been routed, though not conquered.
Mm-hmm.
Ooh. I don't know. I'd rather not be routed, but I guess not being conquered is something,
better. Yes.
Something other than conquered. I don't know. I guess you lost the battle, but still fighting the war.
Right.
Kind of like
You're turned away temporarily. You can come back and fight the battle again.
That's the hope.
Yes. I don't know if it's quite a successful hope. Because, he does talk about, just to guess, get right into it, unless you have other preliminary thoughts.
Unless you have other preliminary thoughts.
No, I don't. But
we
he says,
are in the penultimate
No,
episode.
we're in the ultimate episode. This is the final episode. It's the last episode of this season. Last episode of Season 14. Because he starts off by saying this sentimental socialism has drifted away. Marxism and its offshoots have been made hideous in British and American eyes by the practical demonstration of applied Marxism in the Union of Socialist Soviet Republics. He says, conservatism has manifested a political and intellectual continuity for nearly 165 years, while the radical parties that detested tradition have dissolved in succession, etc., etc. I really don't know if that's true.
Then or now?
Well, then it was true. Now it is not true.
No, I think there's a resurgence of it, but I think there's still a little truth in it. What was the? Oh gosh, I'll have to find it. Where he said, here it is on 399. British socialism, though 3 times successful in attaining power, 3 times has grown sick of itself and surrendered political leadership to the conservatives. And I think that's what the Democrats, the radicals, are doing recently, like with nominating Hillary Clinton. That was even a lot of Democrats were sick of the Clintons, and then nominating Biden, who possibly won, but certainly when he was going to run for re-election, the left got sick of itself.
Right.
I mean, he's the leader of the party and threw it out. And I think Trump's election, this most recently, is also a reflection of just being sick of the Democratic Party and their policies of the radical left, maybe even more so than support for Trump. I mean, I think Trump ran a much better campaign this most recent time, and he was trying to bring in a big tent, but the only reason why anybody wanted to get under that tent is because the circus freaks next door. It's like we don't want the evil clown show. We want to have the circus where they're happy. We don't want this monstrosity or whatever the Democrats were in their tent. And so I thought that was a really good turn of phrase, because that's what happened, in the 30s and 40s, with socialism. And I think we're seeing that play out again with the current socialists. For instance, Chicago, they have a socialist mayor,
right? And
his approval ratings are even lower than Trump. He's in the teens, maybe. Everybody hates that guy. And that's a predominantly left or Democrat city, and so they just got sick of themselves,
right?
And they're going to have somebody else, which may not be a great improvement, but. So the beginning of the chapter made me feel better in the sense that he's talking about how even though the conservatives have been routed, there was really no victor. It's not like there's some great towering power victorious over conservatism even then. In the 1950s, the conservatism, intellectual conservatism, was on the outs. It really didn't have a resurgence, in my opinion, until Barry Goldwater was influential in trying to refocus that. Of course, Reagan who was fighting, even in the 50s with his radio programs and publications and all that stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting because then he moves on. He says, well, where are the places where conservatism is still held on? He says, there's been a lot of losses, definitely, but some things are still good or even better than, 1789. He points to the churches.
Yeah.
He says, if the churches of Britain and America are not altogether in a sound condition, still they are healthier than they were in 1789. I think that is one place where things have slipped. I think we're in a slight period now where things are getting a little bit better. But the idea that, the churches are still just as strong as they were back in the late 18th century is probably not true, just with the declining rates of church attendance since the 1960s.
True. I would say one caveat is the Catholic Church is no longer illegal in any of the states. Because it was which state was it? Which state where it was banned? It wasn't Georgia.
I'm not sure. I know there was one of them, but
I can't. I was just reading about the guy.
I can look it up if you'd like.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, the Catholic Church has expanded as influential, and we're seeing I feel, I guess I don't really intellectually know that there's being a revival or a resurgence, but I kind of feel like there might be. And, regular churchgoers of all denominations are still a bulwark against radicalism mostly, but too many of the Christian denominations have been co-opted by the left and politicized.
Yeah.
But
the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which then became Massachusetts, banned Catholic priests. After the 1689 Protestant Revolution, Maryland, which was previously founded as a Catholic refuge, also outlawed Catholicism, restricted priests, and banned Catholic schools.
That's it.
Yeah,
Maryland. Because I was thinking it was Maryland, but then I was thinking that doesn't make sense because it was named after Mary. But it was Maryland. It was I forget who the guy was that was spearheaded that. He had I don't know why I was reading about him. It was almost like a short biography of the guy. And he plotted out the city, and he was really kind of a control freak, I guess, and it ended up being a failure, and he went back to Great Britain. But yeah, so you couldn't even be a Catholic in one state in that era,
right?
And there was a lot of persecution against Catholics.
So that is good.
Yeah, and there wasn't the federal government could not establish a state religion, but I think the states could.
Yeah, I think all the original 13 colonies had state religions at the time of the founding. They persisted. I think all of them still continued at least until some years after the existence of the United States.
Interesting.
Yes. Then he moves on to political institutions, and he says, the outward shape of things has altered little in either Britain or the United States. And I thought this was really funny because he points to specifically the House of Lords in the UK. He says, however reduced in authority, still admits the principle of aristocracy and possibly may be so reformed as actually to increase its influence. We were just talking about that the other week with them basically giving up like the predominantly aristocratic principle, the hereditary lordships. So that's certainly not true. Talks about private property, which I think is generally still the case, at least in America. You do still have this tendency towards like great appreciation of private property. Usually the sort of confiscations don't quite go through, even though they're always proposed. Although that millionaire tax in California, I know did that actually go through, or is that just
it has not?
Okay,
it's a ballot proposition, and it's called a billionaire's tax, but it can go down below $1 billion. But that's an asset tax, which would be revolutionary, and you do see some radical leftists talking about abolishing private property and certainly over a certain value. But that I kind of think it might be dead in the water, although it spooked a lot of the super wealthy out of California because it would be backdated to January 1, 2026.
Right.
And so they all hightailed it out of there December 31st.
Yeah.
So not all, the ones that really were getting out fast did it in a hurry. And it's kind of funny. I think I mentioned before, I like that podcast, All In Podcast, and David Sachs was holding out, and he was living in California. He left. Yeah. And they have like an annual conference, the All In Summit, that they do every year. But he's flying in for that event and flying immediately out. I mean, he might be staying overnight one night, but he doesn't want to have anybody arguing that he's established any residency or he's earned any money there.
Wow. That's pretty crazy.
Yeah. And so a lot of the really wealthy people are doing that. They're just coming in for meetings. They may fly in and fly out the same day.
Right.
And then they can't argue.
You've established residence here. You've made money.
Because, like you see, the professional sports teams don't want to have their big bowl games in California because they will be taxed, and they tax on I forget how California does it, but it's like a confiscatory tax, so that they might actually lose money by playing one game of their season in California. So they're like, I don't even want to play the Super Bowl. Yeah. If you're going to have it in California, it's stupid. Yeah. Might as well just act like I'm hurt or something.
Yes.
Anyway.
Then he moves on to the fourth thing that he thinks is still continuing. He says, respect for established usage and longing for continuity are not dead among English-speaking peoples either. I'm really not sure about that one. I don't really know what his measurement is, but he says two are pretty much dead in the water. I think these have only gotten worse. He says the conservatives' route has been most serious where the principle of leadership, the idea of order and class is concerned, and also in the necessity for combining reverence with the spirit of self-reliance, moral and social. So he thinks some institutions have survived, but in terms of like attitudes towards conservative principles, attitudes towards leadership and class, and reverence for sort of these social institutions, that has completely fallen away by the early 1950s. And I think that's gotten much, much worse since. That even where these institutions do exist, nobody really cares. Or thinks that we should really care about bringing these things back or what their importance for our way of life is.
Yeah, and I like this quote of 401. I think that's where you're at, right?
Yeah.
He says, last sentence or so in that last full paragraph, or the mid paragraph. Anyway, if conservatives cannot redeem the modern masses from the sterile modern mass mind, then a miserable collectivism which impoverishes both soul and body impends over Britain and America. The collectivism that now has deluged Europe east of the Elbe and the Australian Alps.
Austrian,
sorry. Not Australian. That's a whole different thing. That's like Obama saying they speak Austrian. The collectivism, as Orwell wrote, of the streamlined men who think in slogans and talk in bullets. And that's really what the left is. And I really like how he describes it as the modern masses from sterile modern mass mind. I mean, especially with now, I think he'd be aghast at social media and how it's like this collective hive mind, one way or the other, on any particular issue. And presently, there's a significant portion of people that do just think in slogans and talk in bullets. Yeah. Like that. A high-profile example is that poor executive that works for United Healthcare got assassinated on the street. And you still see, people, occasionally there'll be people like saying, well, I'm happy he died or whatever. I've never heard a bad thing about the guy. Yeah. I understand, healthcare industry, people hate them, or the pharmaceutical industry, they hate them. But I've never seen any specific claim that he made a decision that negatively impacted anybody.
Right. It's just because he was in charge of the organization. Yeah, that's the only reason.
It's like this collective guilt for a systematic problem. I'm all for criticizing insurance companies and all, but I'm like, well, why is he the one that gets picked out? Yeah. And I still don't know why he was picked out.
Yeah. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that's what he says. I mean, that's really what a lot of Kirk's message is throughout the rest of this chapter, that he thinks that liberalism has failed in some ways. And he thinks that liberalism, where it does still exist, is this collectivist principle. And he says, this is on 402, he says, the intelligent conservative then will not attempt to convince the public that political collectivism may be moderated, for it cannot stop short of a barbarous social demoralization, but he will endeavor to show men precisely how and under what guise the menace of collectivism impends over Western society. So you can't just argue, oh, well, we can contain these ideas over here. No, this is a threat to our entire way of life. If we want, America, if we want England to continue, you have to argue against collectivism entirely. Yeah. That's what he says. And I know he references, Tocqueville's, sort of social, his quiet, totalitarianism and things like that. This just sort of societal rot that sort of seeps in, he sees as the biggest threat. And that should be the target of conservatives throughout the rest of the 20th century. In my youth, of course, I've always been a First Amendment free speech advocate. But as I get older, I look at the laws that
basically outlawed being a member of the Communist Party.
Right.
And I'm thinking, I understand better the logic behind it. Like, it wasn't just,
we don't like those ideas.
it wasn't just a red scare. Oh, we're scared of these people. It's actually a dangerous, dangerous belief system, and put into action, it just causes all sorts of mischief. And so that's, that's the quote you gave was a great one. And then I like 403 says, he talks about like the writers of the journals, the liberal journals, he says, whose notion of liberalism gradually had become a readiness to be liberal with other people's money. Which I thought was pretty funny. Just a little like Margaret Thatcher.
Right.
Quote,
right.
At some point you run out of spending other people's money.
Yeah. And that's what he says, continuing on 404 and 405. He says, generally the liberal principle becomes the promise to establish the cradle-to-grave welfare state.
Yes.
Because he does think, and I think rightly so, that liberalism sort of as an ideology was defeated in some ways, sort of in that mid-20th century. And so what do you do in that situation? How do you maintain power? Will promise people you're just going to sort of take care of them and coddle them for the rest of their lives. And that kind of still is the left's sort of guiding principle in a lot of political issues, is just, the whole social safety net, the whole, like we were saying, the billionaire tax, why do these people have more? You should have that money. And all of these different things where it's not really a cohesive ideology. They kind of cram it all into one big sort of encompassing ideology, but it's more so just, well, how do we sort of provide a comforting life through government means for people, expanding this sort of totalitarian collectivist idea.
Yeah, and I wouldn't just limit it to the left. I think it's been the one of the few bipartisan agreements is this beyond the social safety net, and two of the things that are always bothering me. I guess it'd be on my list of pet peeves, which gets longer by the day. But these are old pet peeves of mine. One is, I'll say the first one relevant to the reading is, every time there's a problem, somebody said the federal government has to do something. It's like, no, that's not true. And I was always kind of hesitant to criticize FEMA for disaster mistakes. Like, there was a big hurricane that dumped a bunch of water in Georgia, in the areas north of Florida. Lots of flood. And of course, they did discriminate against there's documents saying they saw a Trump sign and they skipped that house.
Yeah.
But generally, first responder disaster relief is state level.
Yeah.
It's city, county, state level. And then the federal government acts as a backstop. They don't have people, they don't have enough people and resources to be the first responders for all those things. And everybody's like, oh, the federal government has to do something. And the other thing is, and it bothers me in my professional capacity so much when people say, well, if we do that, we could be liable.
Yeah.
Like, what do you mean liable for what? and to whom? Well, we don't we have to do this because otherwise we liable? Like we'll be sued, and who's going to sue you? What are the damages?
Right.
And what law is preventing us from doing X? Well, I just thought that we couldn't do X, or we had to do Y. And well, no, you don't have to. You can do one or the other.
Right.
And, anybody can sue you, but it doesn't mean they're going to be successful. You can't live your life in fear. So the people always think there's laws that apply to everything. Of course, nowadays, they almost do.
Yeah.
But
and that's basically what he talks about.
Yes.
I'm skipping ahead a little bit to 407 because he sort of gives this history of sort of the failures of liberalism and radicalism. Where does that end us up with? He says, throughout the world, a new revolutionary theory and system seem to be taking substance. What Tocqueville predicted long ago as democratic despotism, but harsher than he expected even that tyranny to be. In some sense, what Mr. James Burnham calls the managerial revolution, super bureaucracy arrogating to itself functions that cannot properly appertain to the bureau or the cabinet, the planned economy encompassing not merely the economy proper, however, but the whole moral and intellectual range of human activities, the grand form of Planwirtschaft, state planning for its own sake, state socialism devoid of the sentimental aims which originally characterized socialism. And I think that's just spot on, that it is just everything needs to be done by the government. Everything is just sort of summed up. We need an agency for this. You need a department for this. Everything is just going to be under this giant ballooning structure, and you're not really ever given a reason why, other than, well, this is just what the government does, and you never really stop to think, well, should the government be doing that? Should that be the job of more local institutions and things like that? No, it's just everything's straight to the highest level.
Yeah, and I see this on a day-to-day basis on local government where you'll have a neighbor dispute. So that guy's pointing his gutters to my yard. Well, they come to the city. Like, you need to do something about it. I don't know. Maybe you do something about it. Maybe talk to him or sue him or something. You know, he's diverting water if it's causing damage. Well, it's not causing damage. It's annoying. Well, if it's only annoying to you, why is it the
all of a sudden everybody's problem?
The entire community, and you know, like everybody complains about HOAs. And then, but it's really bad when people are insisting the city take, you know, like police action against their neighbors and say, well, what? The city didn't have a dog in this fight. You know, you guys can't get along. And then, you know, that we end up with is like a neighbor with 15 floodlights and 5 cameras facing his neighbor. And the other one has 10 floodlights and 4 cameras. And now that could be a problem with the lights and all that stuff. But, it might be municipal intervention, but you see this mentality, this even at the local level, this extra bureaucracy, and of course, you know, with the federal government, it's just insane how big it's gotten, and the state government as well, the budgets, and they have an insatiable desire. These government workers have insatiable desire for our taxes. It will never decrease. It'll never go away, and it's really quite astounding to see. So often, over and over again, well, we raise taxes.
Right.
I don't know, you know, you have like millions of dollars in reserves. Yeah. So that means every year you have significantly more money coming in than you're spending. And you have all these benefits for everybody. Why don't you maybe reduce taxes so that you're more closer to revenue and expenditure?
Right.
Oh, we have to plan for the future.
Talking about
I don't know. Okay.
But kind of related to that, he says on 408, which I think is a great point, he says that as the advocates of a planned new society tend to reject traditional liberties, so they incline to break with democracy. To speak today of the defense of democracy as if we were defending something which we knew and had possessed for many decades is self-deception and sham, says Mr. Carr. It seems inconceivable that we can return to the individualistic democracy of a privileged class, and by the same token, we cannot return to the exclusively political democracy of the weak state exercising only police functions. We're committed to mass democracy, to egalitarian democracy, to the public control and planning of the economic process, and therefore to the strong state exercising remedial and constructive functions. And you see this all the time, a little bit on both sides, but especially on the left, where it's like, well, the democratic thing is to have all these social programs, as if that is in any way related to democracy in any way. Democracy is just a way that we make decisions.
Right.
But everything's under this label of, well, the democratic thing is to provide for our neighbors and to do the nice thing and raise taxes and have all these social support programs that never really ever seem to work. But that's democracy, and we have to defend that all the time, is defending that, and that is democracy.
They forget that democracy is also us voting no.
Right.
Nope, that's over. And voting in people that say, we're gonna end that.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, Gavin Newsom was just giving some sort of press conference, and he was asked about, well, what happens if a Republican governor wins California?
Oh, they'll recall him.
Well, what they were saying is not even that. He's saying, well, we have enough institutions, we have enough people in the right places that we can just
ignore him,
essentially. We can just keep, these liberal democratic principles and keep operating. And that's like just the most anti-democratic thing of all time, that people vote on something and you just withhold power and all of these institutions. She was just stating that explicitly, that we will just ignore the governor and we will just continue to operate with this massive bureaucracy that we've formed. Yeah.
Well, that's exactly what they said and did in Trump 1.
Yeah.
That's why he's such a radical in Trump 2 with regard to firing people.
Yeah.
Because he summarily fired a lot of people, and it's uncertain right now whether he had the authority to do it.
Yeah.
And I think the people suing him for it are going to rue the day long term, because I think the Supreme Court's going to say no, that's the executive, and it doesn't matter what Congress says about hiring and firing. They work for the president. The president has to have the ability to fire him. And I think that decision is going to be coming down next year. And that would undo the entire, so-called civil service reform back in the, 1920s. where you had, of course, civil service back then, you had to test in.
Right.
Like there were civil service tests, which were not gimmies. Now there's no testing, and so you just get this, you get the job for life, I guess.
Right.
Pretty much. Anyway, I did like, he talks about like, the society, the bureaucratic society and the ever encroaching and everything, but he really lays into and predicts our current problem with education. He said, these people, talking about these bureaucrats, these super bureaucrats. And he says, this is on 409 here, says, school beyond their proper worldly prospects, or indeed beyond their intellectual capacities, lacking property, lacking religious faith, lacking ancestors or expectation of posterity, seeking to gratify by the acquisition of power their loneliness and their nameless hungers. Oh, I mean, doesn't that describe a lot of people that are trying to seek power in our government? I think it really does. It's scary.
Absolutely. He continues on sort of the similar lines for a while. I do really like, he has this quote from T.S. Eliot. He says, what are the voices speaking out against this? This is on page 411. He says, the menace is imminent. This is Russell Kirk. For our mechanical civilization already has accustomed masses of the population to the idea of society considered as a machine itself. This is from T.S. Eliot. The tendency of unlimited industrialism is to create bodies of men and women of all classes, detached from tradition, alienated from religion, and susceptible to mass suggestion. In other words, a mob. And a mob will be no less a mob if it is well-fed, well-clothed, well-housed, and well-disciplined. Yeah. And this kind of goes back to what we were talking about, throughout this whole season, is this tendency of these radicals sort of on the left to think that, well, if we just provide these material benefits, people will morally improve. That this is sort of the key to sort of human progress. We can change human nature if we just have more and more social programs and provide for these needs. Then people will just make the right decisions. And T.S. Eliot recognizes, well, of course, that's just not going to happen. That's just going to lead further down this path of this collectivist, flat society where nobody really cares about anything because now everything's just prepared for you and everything's just handed to you from the government, and the only thing you're worried about is how you can get the government to hand you more things. Yep.
And speaking of that, he's writing this in the early days of Social Security.
Yeah.
So he talks about that in 413. He talks about an extension of the Social Security provisions to cover a great number of self-employed persons. And he talks about the expansion of Social Security because it was controversial at the time, and now it's like what they call it, the third rail of politics. But I think I mentioned a couple times that Social Security was expanding and as these social programs in America, and it's kind of jarring to read criticisms of it because you never hear any criticism of the Social Security system. Now I don't have a problem with the retirement system, but the disability system is completely corrupt. Yeah. And that's the explanation for a lot of people who are just not working here. How do they pay their bills? Because what happens is you get on Social Security disability, and I think it's within 6 months, you then qualify for Medicaid or Medicare. I think it's Medicare. So you get all the free health care, and you also are probably going to qualify for subsidized housing, right, subsidized food, and all those other government benefits. And you can't live comfortably, but you certainly can live adequately without having to work at all. And it first struck me when I was a public defender, and they had to fill out these income statements, and they're like, they've been arrested for burglary and assault and this and that, and I'm like, okay, well, where do you live and how do you pay your bills? And they said, well, I'm on disability. I'm like, you're disabled? The guy can murder me with his bare hands. And that was back when I was in shape, and I saw it again and again and again, and you see it when I was a prosecutor. The defendants getting government benefits, and they were upset if they were in jail for too long because they might stop losing their direct deposit checks while they're in jail. They might not, and like when they're put on a pay docket, it would come up all the time. Where we're saying, okay, you got to fine some minor offense. You got a fine of $200 plus costs. Can you pay it today? No. Okay. Do you need time to pay? Yes. Well, we're going to set the first payment of $25 or whatever it is on such and such a date. They said, well, can you change it to blank date because I get my check on the first of the month or whatever it is. Like, check for what? I'm on disability. What are you talking about? You got a DWI, leaving the scene, and all this other stuff. And it became a running joke, So like, it was in a particular court, and when somebody would say, "I need an extension" or "I need a different date because I'm on disability," the clerk would look at me, the judge would look at me. I was like throwing up my hands. I don't know, and it'd happen a couple of times a night. Oh yeah, I mean, it was that frequent. Wow. It was like, oh my gosh, or the older lady. I'm on a fixed income. They're not old, retirement age. They're like my age now. They're like in their 50s. And like, wait a second, how are you on a fixed income? Are you independently wealthy and you're having an annuity or some sort of benefit? No, they're on disability. They've been on disability for 30 years. They're in their 50s. They got on disability in their 20s. For
just
3
left,
decades, they've never legally worked for a living. And that's the whole cash business. Anyway, sorry about that little rant side path.
No, that's all right.
But he's talking, and it's like you start with a valuable, focused program, and then you expand it so much. And I'm 55, almost 56. And I don't think I'm going to see a dime of Social Security.
Yeah.
I'm fairly confident you're never going to see a dime.
I don't think so. Well, I haven't been paying into it for as long as you have, so it's not as big of a problem for me.
Well, it's like none of us have been paying into it because you pay it, but then they just funnel it over to there's a I don't know, a couple $1 trillion in IOUs owed to the Social Security system from our general revenue. Well, who pays that? Well, us.
Yeah.
But whatever.
Yeah. Well, moving on from sort of his
Next
descriptions,
section?
yes, because then he gives sort of 4 major points that the conservative has to focus on sort of in the future.
I think these are good.
Yes,
yeah?
I think these are great. And I really like the first one. I'm going to read this paragraph in
full. Whole thing?
Yes, and I won't do that for the other ones, but I think this is great. He says, the problem is spiritual and moral regeneration, the restoration of the ethical system and the religious sanction upon which any life worth living is founded. This is conservatism at its highest, but it cannot be accomplished as a deliberate program of social reform, political Christianity, in quotes. This is a quote here. He says, there's a tendency, especially among the English-speaking Protestant peoples, to treat religion as a kind of social tonic that can be used in times of national emergency in order to extract a further degree of moral effort from the people, Mr. Christopher Dawson observes. If the conservatives' effort comes to no more than this, it will fail. Spiritual restoration cannot be a means to social restoration. It must be its own end. And I think that's spot on. I mean, you see that sometimes with some people. I mean, even sort of like the Jordan Peterson types, or who was it who came out, was it Richard Dawkins?
Yes.
Who was like, oh, well, I wish we still had Christianity. He's one of the big new atheist figures. He's like, well, Christianity works really well as a social tonic. But if that's all that it is, then there's no reason for people to be religious. Nobody's going to be convinced to become religious because it's like, well, it'll help you like bond as a group. So I can do that in other ways. I can go to the Rotary Club or something. It's like, no, you have to really emphasize that there's a truth in religion and that, we should be a religious people, not just a people sort of with this common cultural heritage. Like there's something more than that. The social tonic's good. That's a good result of it, but it can't be that can't be the end of it. And I think he's absolutely right about that. Yeah,
the social benefits are just, I don't know if you say unintended consequence of religion, but if you're a believer, that's not your primary focus. It's just one of those salutary effects of the belief, especially with Christianity. So I thought that paragraph was a great description of what is the power for conservative thought and how limited it is. You can't just say everybody go to church.
Yeah, and I think there are good signs in that regard. Like I don't think the general numbers like nationwide of religion are that great. But I think of like the most conservative people, they are like ardently religious. Yeah. That these people who are going to be in politics, especially the young people who are going to be in high political positions in the future, they don't see religion as just sort of a social tonic. They see it as something that is like vital to who they are, and there's a need to be religious, and it's not just a show. At least that's the sense that I get from being in these traditional conservative circles and things like that.
Well, I think we have the benefit now. The youth has seen the lack of merit of the secularism. It just destroys everything. And so as an alternative, it's like, all the pursuits for happiness, like doing drugs or alcohol or promiscuity or even just travel, I just want to travel everywhere. I saw a post the other day. It was somebody commented, there was a couple, young married couple who were saying, we don't have kids, we travel. And they had like these little thin booklets of everywhere they traveled, and it was like a bookshelf of them. And somebody posted, hope you enjoy the shelf of books when you die. Yeah. Because you'll be alone. And it's true. It's like that's you'll never get satisfaction from those things. And I think it's becoming obvious because we've let everybody do whatever. We're basically like a libertine country now. Right. I mean, what is it that you cannot do, like that you will get fired for because you did this in your private life? I'm not sure. You could even commit crimes depending on the type of job you have and the type of crime. But anything that you want to do sexually or with drugs, now there might be some drug testing. But, it's got to be pretty extreme to have any sort of realistic social consequence. So it's all you get the benefit and the detriment to you and your soul and your individual happiness. And I think people, because we've just let everybody do whatever, people are like, wait a second. I see these 30 and 40-year-old adolescents and they're miserable. Yeah. And I don't want to be them. Yeah. I got whatever they did. We got to figure out something because I'm not going to do. I don't want to end up like that. Yeah. They act like they're happy, but boy, they ain't happy. Yeah. I mean, not any one of them.
What's the acronym? The dual income, no kids. The DINKS. Where it's like, it just seems like a miserable life. You both just go off to work in the day and then you just travel and build up a shelf of books. And I guess that's the whole
mother
purpose
and I
of
would we'd question what do these people do with their time?
Yeah.
They must have nothing but time. And I know that's valuable and that's good, but like compared to us when we have 4 little kids, it's like I didn't have time to do anything. And we would look at these people, and they were like people our age that decided not to have kids. They're like, what do they do all day? Yeah. I guess they watch TV because invariably they don't read. Yeah. There's some sort of crossover there.
Funny that works.
But some of them do, like, oh, we're going to go to the coffee shop and read and whatever. But I don't know. Yeah. Which is nothing wrong with that. Yes. I like doing that too.
Yes. No, that's great.
Now I have time.
Yes. But then he says that the second sort of aim, he says the problem of leadership. And he has 2 aspects of this: the preservation of some measure of veneration, discipline, order, and class. And I thought this was funny. He says the purgation of our system of education, so that learning once again may become truly liberal. That you just need to reform the entire educational system. And I know that Trump has at least made some, progress in that direction. We'll see how much it sticks.
Yeah, I mean, essentially abolishing the Department of Education. I mean, it still exists, but it's like a pass-through grant program now. And basically deregulating most of what they were doing, and that's a huge change. That was probably the most recent cabinet. It was created under Carter, but yeah, there's change there. But I think this guy's ahead of his time on that one.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And then he moves on to the third problem, which is pretty much exactly what we were talking about. He says you just have to encourage people that they have a purpose in life. Yeah. He says the generation of the family to mere common house tenancy menaces the very essence of recognizable human character. So you have to restore purpose to labor and domestic existence to give men back old hopes.
Yeah, and to go back to the example I was talking about, the travel people, and I don't mean that as a complete criticism of who they are, because they probably have things that they could do and be successful at and be great, productive members of the society and create things. They don't have to have children, although I don't know why they wouldn't. But spending your time just traveling to vacation spots it's just such a, going on vacation occasionally is great. But to kind of devote all your free time and extra resources to it just seems so selfish and self-centered.
Well, it's completely fleeting, right? Because it's like, we're making memories and things like that. Well, those aren't going to be around when you die.
Especially get early onset Alzheimer's. Yeah. My God.
That's true.
You'll be 50-year-old. You don't even know what the hell you're doing.
Yeah. Then he says the fourth problem is the problem of economic stability. And he says, clarifying this doesn't mean, again, this giant welfare state, but you have to have that relationship between, what you do and the reward you get from it. Yes. We've just completely lost that. In fact, this, ballooning welfare state actually harms that relationship because then there's just not this incentive to work. So those are the 4 major problems, and I think they all really kind of stem, from that first one, right? The spiritual purpose, and definitely with 2 and 3, maybe 4 slightly separate. But I think he's absolutely right that has to be the target of conservatism.
I'd like to. I agree with that. If you don't mind, I want to skip to 418, which is the end of this subsection, where he's talking about what England still has. What England has to support the conservative movement. And he says, Britain has an aristocracy and landed gentry. Not really anymore.
Nope.
Britain has the Church of England and the Church of Scotland. Nope. Britain has her great middle classes. Nope. Britain has sturdy local government still.
Nope.
Britain has an enormous and valuable empire. And nope. It's all gone. He says, if these institutions go, the world will have lost one of its 2 or 3 chief counterbalances to the anarchy which rises ever closer to the surfaces of modern society. And I wrote next to that, gone. I mean, it's gone.
Yeah.
The positive influence of Great Britain and great English thought, especially conservative thought, is over.
Yeah.
Don't you think? I mean, I think... we always talked. They always talked about the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States because they were a strong ally and English speaking and came from the same empire and all that stuff. I don't see that that's the case anymore.
Yeah.
I think I don't know. It's just so depressing when you read this from the 1950s and you see what it has become.
Yeah. Well, I think it's really interesting because, there's not a single mention of mass migration in here.
True.
Because I don't think he could have even possibly predicted that.
I wouldn't have conceived of it in my youth.
Yeah.
It makes no logical sense that you would allow essentially an invasion of foreign citizens into your country for no apparent purpose.
Right.
In the 80s and 90s, they had, migration across the border, and a lot of it was migrant labor. So during the growing seasons, they're agricultural workers, and then they go back and they come over, they get, they work and then whatever. But to have just people come here and have this huge bucket of people that you'd say they're asylum seekers, asylum from what? I don't know.
Because, I guess you would have been familiar with sort of the early 20th century, Ellis Island immigration, things but then we'd have known that there was then that really strict immigration cutoff, right?
Yes,
and you still have these principles, and then we have to have these people assimilate. Because I think, so much of this book has been, if just sort of the stock of people stays generally the same, they have a tendency to appreciate, the things they grew up with and the institutions. They have a tendency, sort of a natural tendency to preserve those things. And if all of a sudden, especially with local government, if all of a sudden your local government is, majority from an entirely different part of the globe, then there's no reason to keep any of your social institutions.
Well, you see, the major changes in New York City, I don't know if the stat was right, but I think a majority of Madami's voters were foreign-born.
I did see that.
Now, if they're American citizens, I don't have an issue with that. But I don't know that they don't allow non-citizens to vote, because you can allow non-citizens to vote in municipal elections. They do in California. And so it's wait a second, who's deciding what we're doing in our own country? And I think it should be, that's one of the government mandates I think we should enforce nationwide, that no foreign citizen should ever vote for any government official anywhere in the United States, because it's taking away my vote as an American citizen. Even if I'm not eligible to vote in that district, if I go through that district, which I have every right to do because I'm an American citizen, it's part of my country, it should not be controlled by a non-citizen. It's just insane to me that there was a former mayor out in California that got arrested for voting illegally because he was a foreign citizen, but they elected him mayor. Or was it Kansas? It was Kansas, I think, maybe even.
That's crazy.
And just that it could have happened. It would have been an absurd, an absurdist comedy, according to Russell Kirk back in the 1950s, that anybody would even, they'd be like, oh, that would never happen.
Right.
That's just ridiculous.
I thought it was especially interesting, this next section, because then he talks about, well, is there an intellectual tradition for conservatives right now?
Yes.
And he says, it seems like, with all these liberal people say, well, really the only academic position is liberalism. He says, well, that's hollow. There's this great, conservative tendency. There's this conservative revival that's just around the corner.
Yeah.
Where he talks about these different works, talking about conservative academia. He says on 421, he names a few thinkers and their works. He says their ideas are resulting in a popular agitation for conservative reform in American schools. And it's just around the corner. There's going to be this big conservative reform. And I forget where it is in this chapter. I know it was somewhere in here. I don't have it marked because I wasn't writing in this book. But he says something along the lines of the effect like the conservative ground is like ready for the conservative to take if he only puts up half a fight, essentially.
Yeah, right.
And it's like, well, then that just didn't happen, right? Because this is right before the 1960s, this is right before all of these massive reforms. And immediately following that, the conservatives, especially like in academia, as we've talked about in the past, just kind of threw their hands up in the air and just gave it up, which is, again, something that he could not have possibly predicted.
Yeah. It's a wild, like I said, it's really kind of fun reading this, this book from the 1950s and seeing, oh, God, it's jarring. It's like, oh, that's kind of refreshing outlook. It didn't happen, but good on him.
He had a positive spirit.
Like his optimism. He does recognize. I'm going to move ahead to 5. Sure, That's right. The 423 he says, if the hope for conserving the heritage of civilization lies with the United States, intelligent and conscientious Americans cannot delay long in agreeing upon some general plan of action. Well, they did not come up with the plan of action, and here we are. But I do feel like this kind of bizarro conservatism that Trump has brought on has revived a lot of common sense, or like, what was it? Josh Hammer had that common good conservatism.
Yeah.
I'm in favor of that as he articulated. I think having not only looking at what the law would allow, but also what is your purpose in passing a policy or pursuing a policy. It has to be for the common good. And I think we kind of lost track of that as conservatives. It's like we're too legalistic. And, this is constitutional. That's not constitutional. What do you say? Let's start with what do we want to achieve for the people? And then we can see how we can legally do it, and I think I think we're finally getting back to that. Don't you think?
I think I've mentioned this on the podcast before, but like even the name Republic means common good. It comes from res publica, the public thing, right? That is what the government is for. Or that's what the state is for, is to protect the common good. Figure out how to go about doing that is the job of politics. Yeah.
Now, we'll say this. I've been criticizing some local, type people or whatever, tax-hungry people. But in my experience locally in this area, which is the only thing I can say about personally, the vast majority of the people involved are really trying to do it for the public good. Now, sometimes they have a dual purpose because it makes them feel like a big shot,
right.
having done the public good. But it kind of doesn't matter to me one way or the other if that's part of their motivation. It's almost impossible to determine if their ideals were pure.
Right.
But their stated goal is to benefit the public. And they do work literally to benefit the public, even if there's some secondary benefit to them, meaning pats on the back or whatever, or higher office. So I want to kind of put that out there that, I think that's true. I think that's true generally of elected officials all across their country, even the left people, because I think on some levels, they think what they're advocating for and they're pursuing is for the best of the public, like even like Mandami, I think he's wrongheaded about, I guess maybe everything. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really looked at all his position papers, but I'm guessing he's, I think he's an avowed communist or certainly very close to it. But I don't know that I can say that he doesn't, he believes in it. Yeah. Right. Yeah. And if he believes in it and he thinks it's for the best, I'll give him that.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
I don't think I think there's some that just want to burn it all down or they just want power. Maybe he's one of them. But I think most public officials in school boards, in city councils, county government, state government, I think they have a primary goal of trying to help the public. Don't you think?
Yeah, I think generally.
Yeah, I mean, there's exceptions, of course. And there's some really super idealistic people that are like, not the second coming, but I mean, it's like, oh my gosh, that person was just a fantastic person. Just did everything for the right reason. I think there's fewer of those than the other side, which is like, I just want to get people.
Yeah. Not to bring down that hopeful note, but this is the section I was just looking at, because he says, this is sort of what America has, as he was talking about what Britain has. He says, to rally around these institutions, talking about the Constitution, diffusion of property, division of powers. He says, conservative leaders may count upon the agricultural classes, more numerous by far than in Britain and still enormously influential in national affairs. Yeah, not quite.
Gone.
Upon the small towns from which much of America's vigor comes, no, not quite. Sometimes, but I think especially talking about the 50s and 60s, just sort of how much of Middle America was pretty much hollowed out with a lot of the industries moving.
That's very true. Very true.
So I think to an extent, maybe. Upon a very large educated class that may be won by conservatives rather than by radicals, if conservatives only half try.
Yeah,
nope.
that's where it's, no way.
Upon the churches, for Americans remain faithful Sabbatarians, sometimes. Upon a considerable part of the laboring classes, which are likely to be attached increasingly to stable society, the share in things which they have obtained, also really not quite so much anymore. So again, this weird hopeful look where it's all of those things kind of progressively just got more and more hollowed out, especially the 3 decades immediately after he wrote this book.
Yeah. I really like this. I don't know if you had anything other on that section. I like, maybe I would end on this, but feel free to say whatever you want. On the last page, 428, he mentions, America and all that stuff. And he says, Americans will have it in their power to become the saviors of most that is lovely and honorable in civilization. And I think that's, I like to think that's true. And he also talks about, we need to have a nation, a humble nation, which is difficult for Americans, which I concede. But I think we had in the last, wasn't it in last season? I mentioned the word lovely.
Yeah.
And I think that's just a perfect thing to try to preserve, is those things that are lovely and honorable about our civilization. And if you focus on that, I think isn't that really the key to the whole thing?
Yeah. No, I agree. I guess I'll close with just the last paragraph here of the book, because I thought this was nice. It says, our world may be passing from contract back to status. Whether that process is good or evil, conservatives must prepare society for providential change, guiding the life that is taking form into the ancient shelter of Western and Christian civilization. For this, they will require the vision of Burke, the common sense of Adams, the courage of Randolph, the tolerance of Tocqueville, the resolution of Calhoun, the imagination of Disraeli, the stern justice of Stephen, the Catholic learning of More. Democracy in some form will endure. Whether it is to be a democracy of degradation or a democracy of elevation lies with the conservatives. This is this quote. I'm not sure where it's from. He says that they that do change old love for new, pray gods they change for worse. And that is his final concluding quote of this book.
That's excellent.
Yes. Well, what do you think of the book overall?
I thought it was lovely.
Yeah.
No. I think I like the summary. I think it got bogged down with some of the particular people because of the political positions they held, and maybe because it was hard to find conservative thinkers for particular areas that were prominent in that time. But overall, a very good book, and I thought he really brought it all together in that last chapter. Yeah. I feel much better about it after the last chapter, because even though things didn't turn out the way he had hoped, I agree with his hope, what his desire was, and I think now we're all these many years later, I think we're finally turning the corner, maybe, in the direction that he was advocating back in the 1950s. Yeah. And that's, and I think, and of course, he's been an influential author. You hear you hear prominent conservative thinkers that know about him and have read him and have influenced them. And I think that's all to the good.
Yes, I agree.
What are your thoughts?
No, I thought it was great. I think there are very few books like this that are just trying to give a very positive look of conservative thought. And I think where other books do exist, I think they're even more just like, well, here's what happened politically at this period of time. So I think it is very good to have this book that's more so like, well, what is the philosophy of conservatism? Because it can be a hard thing to define. I agree. I think he got bogged down with a lot of the people. I think he included a few too many people that aren't really conservatives, and he kind of acknowledges that. He's like, oh, they're not really conservatives, but they did some good things for conservative, movements in their time. Right. So I think that was, maybe a slight flaw of the book. But no, I mean, I agree. I'm glad he ends on this hopeful note. I
Yes.
think he's still right. I think the problems are still the same.
Yeah.
His hopes aren't quite the same, but I think they are maybe still achievable, especially if you sort of enact the goals that he thinks are most important. I agree with him and sort of what he
Yes.
thinks the goals of conservatism should be. But no, I think it was very good. I'd be really interested to see, what other authors would say, like in the 70 years since, what has been the continuing of the conservative mind, or did it really just sort of stop?
Well, I think I think you've had a lot.
Yeah.
Like Thomas Sowell,
Yeah.
is one. I think Victor Davis Hanson is another. Even Rush Limbaugh should get some credit for decades of off the cuff conservative thought, and even in the early days, like in the 1980s, George Will was great.
Yeah.
Some of them kind of changed over time, I guess.
Well,
but,
Tolkien, of course.
well, yeah, Tolkien. I forgot.
And then
about
he even
Tolkien.
gives like a side mention, I think, to C.S. Lewis,
Yeah,
who would have been
right.
sort of still kind of an up and coming figure,
Right.
Especially during World War II. He had his
Yeah.
radio broadcasts. But yeah, I think like figures like that would absolutely.
I'm trying to think of who else. I know I'm forgetting somebody that should get a. But like I think Thomas Sowell is very influential. Oh, Clarence Thomas
Oh,
and
yeah, of
Alito,
course, yeah.
and Scalia, maybe even more so. In their dissents early on, and then in the majority opinions, just being consistently philosophically conservative, and especially in a legal setting, and not necessarily be outcome based in their rulings, because sometimes their conservative views resulted in criminals getting acquittals, essentially, evidence being suppressed, or some benefit to those accused of crimes, but they articulated a constitutional basis for certain rulings, and so I think you can't forget about those stars of the judiciary and conservative thought back then. And the more I read about Clarence Thomas and hear him speak, I got an opportunity to hear him speak here locally at I think it was a bar dinner, and great speaker.
Yeah.
Very, very, very entertaining. He seems like a neat guy. But I was in the very back row by the door to the kitchen.
Nice.
So
The best seat in the house.
people cleaning off the tables, clank, 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 boom. I mean, it was almost getting hit by the door on the back of my chair. But otherwise, it was a delightful luncheon.
Yes.
Yeah, the table from Jefferson County got the worst seat.
Yeah, that's a
Came
shame.
up to St. Louis.
Yeah, that's a shame.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think that's all the thoughts I have on the conservative
Excellent.
mind. We'll have to think of a
Another
new
good
book.
Yes.
I guess we'll be taking kind of a long break. We'll be going on
Yes.
vacation just a couple weeks, and I'm out in
Yes.
D.C. for 6 weeks, so it might not
Yes.
be until late July that we have another season starting.
Take
up.
the summer off and see if our massive audience will stay with us.
That's true. Yes, we'll have to see. We'll have to see. Do you have any other final thoughts?
No.
All right. Well, then this has been season 14, episode 13 of Unlimited Opinions, the season finale. You can, of course, follow us on Twitter at ULMTD Opinions. I have been Adam Bishop.
I'm still Mark Bishop.